All right, so today we get to a really exciting part of the full stack week. We are going to write a Python web server and connect it to a database. Part one, we're going to learn about a Python framework called Flask for building a web server, and we'll talk about what is a web server, what is Flask, what is the server doing, and then we'll do our sort of hello world with Flask to build our first web server. Then in part two, we are going to connect Flask to a Postgres database, and we'll see how to use two Python libraries called SQL Alchemy and Psycho PG to have Python talk to our database. We'll see how to create a model to connect to a DB table. We'll see how to modify our Flask server to get data. And then finally, retrieving data from Postgres and sending to the client, which is usually the browser. And to start at the beginning here, let's talk a little bit about what is a web server and where it fits in. And to do this, I'm going to go to the diagram that we know and love of a server program, a database, and then our clients. And so kind of just to refresh ourselves, I could be on my computer, on my browser, and I want to talk to Amazon and look up dishwasher pods. And my browser is going to make an HTTP request to Amazon server, which is a server is just a fancy name for a program whose job is to serve information or send it to a client. You'll often hear a computer running a server program called a server. So you hear the word server tossed around a lot. The Amazon website, it might send back HTML, or it might just send back data in the form of JSON data. And so my browser's making requests to a server program. The server then talks to our database. The database sends back that data. And then the server takes the data it's gotten from the database and sends it back to the client. Right? And this is happening for a website like Amazon thousands of times per second. And it's happening with all sorts of devices. Someone else might be on their phone talking to Amazon, also looking for dishwasher pods. And again, Amazon's server will talk to the database to get that dishwasher pod information and send it back to someone's phone. And so this is happening all the time. And so the server program's job is to sort of be the clearinghouse or the messenger between taking data coming in from browsers or phones, talking to a database, getting the data from the database. We might have to manipulate the data and sending it back to the client. We often have additional logic in our server. It might be encrypting a password. It might be what's called business logic. Like if I'm trying to purchase a movie from Amazon, if I'm under 18 and the movie's rated R, maybe Amazon doesn't allow me to do that. And the logic for that code would live here in the server code. So there's a lot of things happening here, but in essence, the server's job is to take these requests from the client and then send back data, whether it's JSON or HTML. And a great example of, and we often call a server whose job is really just to send data, a REST API. And this is a whole bunch of acronyms. API stands for Application Programming Interface. REST we'll learn about later in the course. It's sort of a way of designing an API. And a great example of what I mean by this is the Poke API, which we will come to know and love. And so someone has written a program, a server program that stores information about Pokemon, and they've written a nice website, and I can fetch information about Pokemon. And so, for instance, here, if I want to get a list of all the Pokemon, I can send a request, and we see a sort of example of JSON data being sent back. And in fact, if I want to, let me copy this URL in two parts. Actually, I can just grab it from right here. If I pasted this into my browser, we would see that the browser has talked to the Poke API server, and undoubtedly they also have a database, right? So all of this Pokemon information, this list of all the different Pokemon, probably lives in a database like Postgres, and it's been sent back to me. And if we open up the browser's inspector and we pull this up and we go to my favorite tab, the network tab, and refresh the page, and we have to go, let me do a little filtering here. Let's not worry about all these other things. This is the first request from the browser that happens. It's sent to the server living at this host, right? And remember that when we look at a URL, we have the protocol that this is an HTTP request. We have the host name, which is a user-friendly name for an IP address that says where this lives on the internet on a network. And then we have what's called the resource. And in this case, API/v2/Pokemon, there's not a Pokemon.html file living there. This is telling the Poke API server what kind of information I want. That I want, well, all the Pokemon. And it's going to talk to the database, and then it sends that information back. And we can see here the same information that we're seeing printed here, shown another way. And we see that this looks a lot like a JavaScript object, right? And it's called JSON JavaScript object notation. We see that it starts with some metadata, a list of all the results, all the different Pokemon, but we don't get all the Pokemon. We only get the first 20. And in fact, it gives us a URL that we could use to also talk to the Poke API to get the next 20 Pokemon, which is a little more advanced, but is a pattern where you can sort of like go from one page to another with a lot of data. And then we have here under this results array, the first 20 Pokemon, and we see there's a name. And if I wanted to get information about Squirtle, in fact, here is the Poke API, and we often call this an endpoint as a way just to refer to a URL, a server, an API server is giving us to get data. And again, I see I've got my protocol. I've got my host name that's the same, but now the resource that we want, and it looks kind of like a file path, right? And back in the day, in the early days of the internet, maybe this actually was a path to where a file lived on a server's file system. But today, this data lives in a database like Postgres, and this resource URL part uniquely identifies the thing we want to get, which is in this case, the Pokemon with ID 7, who happens to be Squirtle. And if I go ahead and I grab this URL and let's paste this one in, we see that we get back a whole bunch of stuff here. And we're in fact getting a whole bunch of information about Squirtle, right? Abilities, their name, the form, There's a whole bunch of things floating around here. There's moves. There's a crazy amount of information here about each Pokemon. And in fact, somewhere in here is, if I can find it. And part of the challenge in working with this result data is there's so much stuff. But there's like tons of different images for these Pokemons as well. And so like here is the Generation I red-blue version of Squirtle, an image of their back. Right. And in fact, somewhere in here is an animated one as well. If you start to poke around deep enough, you'll start to find all sorts of things. And I do see a question. Alex, yes, sir.
So when you were breaking down that URL right there, I noticed that there is no port to databases that you're requesting info from
Mhm.
when they give you, or when you're using their URL, it doesn't use a port after the host name?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so there's two ports to think about here. One is the port that this server lives on for the Poke API, and this is what we would call the exposed port, the one that's sort of publicly available to the whole internet. Usually by default, that's port 80. And I, in fact, don't need to specify port 80 for when I'm putting in a URL. And that's why we kind of, when we go to most websites, I think it's port 80.
Unless it's HTTPS, which is 443.
What was that, Rick?
Yeah, I was just saying if it's HTTPS, it goes over port 443.
Oh yeah, you're correct. That's an excellent point. Thank you. Well, yeah, we'll worry about HTTPS later, but in fact, most stuff, the S here stands for secure as in encrypted, which is most websites now. And so like pretty much every web server under the sun that is exposed to the public internet, the old version of HTTP where traffic is not encrypted would be open on port 80, and encrypted, which is everything these days. Like, because if you look at these URLs these days, it's always HTTPS is open on port 443. And in fact, we see with the Poke API, it is indeed HTTPS. I'm not even sure port 80. Yeah, it doesn't like us using unencrypted stuff. So actually, let's change this to port 443. So that's sort of the default port that everything's open to, and browsers are just configured to send our requests to that port. And now over here for the database is not publicly available over the internet, right? And part of the server's job is to sort of protect the database from the rest of the internet. So, it might be port 5432 that the server talks to the database on. That's the default Postgres port. It could be a different port depending on how it's configured. But the nice thing about an API is we don't have to care. Like the data, for all I know, could be like collected by my grandmother and delivered by telegram. The beautiful thing about an API is I just have to know how to make the right kind of request to the server to get the data I want.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Totally. And there's other ways that we can interact with the Poke API as well. And in fact, if I hop over to our code, I have a little bit of JavaScript code here. And tomorrow we'll dig more into what this JavaScript code is doing. But the important part is right here, where we're using this fetch command that's going to make an HTTP request over the internet to the Poke API. And the same way you guys saw me using the curl command on the command line to make an HTTP request. And in fact, we can see that right now. And let me go ahead and just clear this and run it again. and we get back all this crazy information about Ditto, all this JSON data. And in fact, let's just send the output of that into a JSON file. And now that it's in VS Code, I can use VS Code to format it really nicely. And we can see that this is all the different data about Ditto that the Poke API sent back, and that there's all sorts of stuff, and that there's all these other URLs, right, to other resources on the API. With the, looks like these are moves or something. And as we saw before, there's different image assets. And somewhere around here is like, there's 3D image assets, if I can find it. Here we go. There's some animated image assets for the Pokemon. There's GIFs. Like, let's see if I can grab the Ditto GIF. Right. And so there's, I don't know a lot about Pokemon, but apparently that's Ditto. So we get back all this information. And I can write JavaScript code to do that same thing. And that's what this code here will do. And it will then print out, we're not printing out all of that JSON because that's a lot, but we're just going to print out a little bit of it. So if I run my code here, it's going to execute this getMon function that is sending a GET request, an HTTP request over the internet to get that information about Ditto. And again, we see it printed out. So that's the awesome thing about an API or a server, right? Is that anything can talk to it. Including JavaScript code, whether that JavaScript code is running sort of on my command line or maybe in the browser, right? Depending on what I want to do. So today we're going to learn how to write our own server API in Python with Flask and then connect it to a database. And I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions before we move on. Okay, are we all starting to get a feel sort of for the idea of what an API is? Cool. All right, let's start to write one. So we're going to build our server using a Python program called Flask. And in fact, I'm going to take a moment here and we're actually going to pull up a little bit of the Flask docs so that we can have them side by side. Because this is a good habit to get into. Whenever you're working with a new library, you should always spend a little time looking at its docs because they always have lots of really good information. So let's close out all this other stuff and let's go to Flask. And we see that the first result is indeed for the Flask Python web framework. And as it says, Flask is a light work framework. We're going to learn about a heavyweight framework, Django, later. And we have installation and quick start instructions, right? So again, it's always worth just kind of reading through a little bit of the installation. If you go through the quick start, it'll go through a whole lot of different things, and then the tutorial goes more in depth. But we're going to stick to the basics right now, and we're going to go ahead and install Flask. So I'm going to scroll here, right? We need to have a virtual environment activated. Because of InstallFest, I should have my Python virtual default environment activated, but it might not be at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and activate it, and now it is. And now I'm going to run pip install Flask.
Should we be following along, Adam?
No, don't code along. I don't recommend it. Yeah, good question. And if we kind of look through the Flask quick start, we can see it's got a couple different steps for us that make life really easy. And I'm going to put my code here in a file called api.py. We'll come back to this list of students later. We're going to use that to sort of simulate our database. But for now, let's set up our sort of hello world of a Flask server. And now that Flask is installed in my virtual environment, we're going to import Flask. And I'm going to simplify a little bit what they're telling us here in getting started. And let's look a little bit what's going on here before we move any further. First off, I see this red squiggly here that says import Flask could not be resolved. If I run my code though, there might not be like a server running, but it runs just fine. So this is not really an error with the code. This is VS Code getting confused. And when you see this, it usually means we need to tell VS Code where to find Python libraries that we've installed. And to do this, I'm going to hit the VS Code keyboard shortcut Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P on Windows to open the command palette. And we're going to do Python select interpreter. And we want to give it the path to our Python virtual environment. And so if I type which Python 3, I have the absolute path to where the version of Python in my virtual environment is running. So I can go ahead and grab that and paste that in here and hit enter. And let's see, I wanted to create a new one. Let's try that one more time. Enter interpreter path. I clicked the wrong option. We click enter interpreter path, and then we enter that path and we hit enter. And now we see that that red squiggly has gone. So what are we importing from Flask? If I look at this, I see that this starts with a capital F, right? And in Python conventions, that means that this is a class. If I right click here and do go to definition, or you can use the F12 keyboard shortcut, or actually go to, let's see here. My apologies. I thought that this should be working. Let's see, if we can't get this working, we will just keep on rolling. But let's see here. VS Code, Python, installed, go to definition, no definition. What is almost definitely happening is something related to VS Code not finding like the virtual environment or Flask, even though it should be able to go there. I thought we had the correct Python interpreter. But yeah, I apologize. That doesn't seem to be working at the moment. But what we'll do is we'll go to Flask's GitHub page and we'll look at the code for this Flask class, which is where I wanted to go. And I think what we're going to do is I'm just going to search for class Flask. There we go. And it looks like it's right here. So my apologies. There must be something with VS Code not quite finding where I've installed this in my virtual environment, though I thought I had resolved that issue. But here's another way to look at the source code of Flask, and I just wanted us to peek into this for just a bit. And we can see here, there's a whole lot of really interesting documentation. It kind of even tells us how to use the Flask class, right? And this is all in the Python doc string. As we keep on scrolling, we see that there's a lot of really good documentation about how to use this, which is the norm for a good open source project. And it's just a good habit to get into, to looking a little bit at the source code of libraries and things. And we're not going to worry about this now, but later we are going to come back to this, and we can see that there's some sort of property on this class called default config related to configuring our Flask server, I bet. And it's some kind of dictionary. It's a special kind of dictionary. It's an immutable dictionary, but it's still a dictionary. And there's all these different settings that we can give it, whether we're in debug mode or not, or so on. And we can see there's all sorts of methods here. The dunder init that we've come to know and love. And then all sorts of other methods as well. And in fact, if we search for let's see here. The config is somewhere else. But if we look in this dunder init method, somewhere in here, we're actually returning. I apologize because I can't find it. But we end up really creating and returning our Flask server here. And I think the best move is for me to just start writing the code out here for us to see it. So here I've actually created an instance of my Flask server, but it's not really doing anything yet. It's not even running. And to run it, I need to do app.run. And I need to set a couple configuration options here. I want to put it into debug mode, so it will print out lots of information. And I want to tell it what port to run on. And we're going to have it run on port 8000. And so now if we kind of go to our other diagram that has the different ports on my computer, right? VS Code Live Server, when we used it, was running on port 5500. Postgres is always running on port 5432. And now we have on port 8000, we have our Flask app that's going to be running there. And now if I do Python API.py, we see a different message in the command line. We see my hello print statement. And then we see when we call this run method on Flask, we get a bunch of print statements serving Flask app, debug mode on. Warning, debug mode is on. When you're using this for real in production, don't put it on debug mode. And it tells me where I can go to talk to my server, right? And this IP address 127.0.0.1, that is the IP address of my own computer. It's the same thing as localhost. And it's running on port 8000 because I told it to. And if I paste this into my URL bar, we see this not found message. The requested URL was not found on the server, so on and so forth. Flask has an HTML template by default for when you try to go somewhere where we haven't set up, it's called a route yet. But we also see over here this interesting message. We see the IP address the server is running on, the date and the time, and we see that some information about this HTTP request, and that it was a GET request. Here's the route or the resource it was trying to go to, and a little bit more information about the kind of request it was. All right, and in fact, if I open up my network tab and refresh the page, again, ignoring all that other stuff, that's something else, we can see the same thing, and that this is coming from Flask's built-in behavior. So if I want to get something more useful, I have to create what's called a route. And to do this, I start with a function. And let's just write a normal function, and we'll just call it get homepage. And it's going to return, and I'm just going to write the world's simplest HTML. I'm not even going to write a full HTML page. Flask will sort of take care of the rest. And I'm going to write the HTML as a string, and we're going to say, hello world, my homepage. So far, so good. And it would help if I put this run command after we define get homepage. But now, how does Flask know when to call this function? I have to tell Flask when it should call this function. And we do this with a decorator. So kind of similar to getters and setters, but it's not a property decorator. It's Flask's app decorator. And we're telling Flask that this function is something special. It's what we call a route function or an endpoint. And I have to tell it the path that this route is on. And so this is plain old slash. And we'll start with just with that. And I think that should do it. And let's see, I may have yeah, we will talk about this in just a moment. That should resolve my error though. And so my Flask server is running again. And now if I refresh my page, we see hello world, my homepage. And we see that the browser made a request. We see over here at the very end is this slash, and that then Flask sent back this text. And there's different kinds of HTTP requests. And we call these the HTTP verbs. Let's use a Python multi-line comment, the docstring, not the JavaScript style. And this is part of how you design an API. When I want to fetch data, I'm using the get verb in my HTTP request. When I want to modify existing data, I'm going to use put. When I want to create something new, put new data in the DB, I'm going to use post. And then when I want to delete something, I'm going to use delete. And we'll learn more about these later, but what these let us do is tell the server what to do with the information that we're sending it. Like, I want you to find this in the database. I want you to modify this in the database. I want you to add this to the database. I want you to delete this from the database. And it lets us do it through HTTP requests. And if I make another route, just to show sort of an example here, why don't we make another route and let's just call it get about page. and we'll say about, this is my website, right? I'm keeping the HTML really simple just for simplicity's sake. And again, I need to tell Flask when it should call this method that it's a route. And so I use the app.route decorator. And this time I say /about. And again, we're going to say methods get, because I'm not going to be asking the server to modify, delete, or create new data. I'm going to just be asking it to return me data. And now over here, if I go to /about, we see our about message. And if I opened up another terminal and I use the curl command line command, I could do the same thing, right? And so we now have a server running, in fact, with a couple different routes. And so I just want to pause here and check in and see what questions folks have or what's on people's minds. Rick, yes, sir.
And just more of a, so people understand, so this port 88, and it's kind of a cool thing, but this 8000, or is it 8080? So if you go to any computer that's on the network of this computer, and you know what the IP address of the computer is, like say it's like 10.0.0.5 or whatever it is, if you type that into your browser and do the colon 8000, you can actually get to this server from any other computer on the network. It's kind of cool, but it's just, you know, more understanding. So this is why you got to be like careful about, like, you know, who might be on your network, or if you're on like um what I'm trying to say, Starbucks, um, whatever you're throwing on port 80 is going to be seen by everybody on that network.
Yeah,
So
I think the questions around kind of like network security are a little out of scope, but
yeah,
that's,
sorry.
no, it's all good. But
Just
that's a really good
understanding.
point. Yeah, like for a local network, like say maybe a school network, or like you're saying, you know, if you're, when you connect to the Wi-Fi on Starbucks, that said, I think it depends like what ports you expose, but a school network is a good example. Like I might have two different computers and they might have two different IP addresses. I'm just kind of making up, that's probably not even a proper IP, but that's okay. Two different ones. And like you were saying, if I kind of want to maybe talk to a program, like say my Flask server running on my buddy's computer, as long as we're on the same network and our computers are exposing these ports, I could send a request over the network and it would look something like this. But again, this is a bit out of scope, so don't worry about this too much right now. But indeed, this is how like different computers would talk over a network. So now that we've got this working, let's start getting some data in here, right? Like we have with the Poke API. Let's start making our site more interesting. So it's not just about, this is my website, right? And we have all of this nice student data that I kind of stuck all the way down here at the bottom. And so let's in fact put this all the way at the top. Let's just put it right here and we'll just let it live there. And what I want to do now is, just like I could write a normal function to maybe get all of my students and just return those students, right? And this would return that list of dictionaries. Well, let's make it a route. And as you folks can probably see, there's sort of conventions around how to write the URLs for websites and for APIs. And as our sites get more complex, we might have some routes that are returning like HTML pages like we have here. And we might have other routes that are returning data, like with the Poke API. And it's pretty common to have a route start with API when it's returning data. And you usually also add the version of the API so that as time goes on, if we need to change different versions, we can have backwards compatibility and still keep the old one. And then we have the name of the thing, which is usually a noun. The same way we make a student's class or a student's table, we're now sort of making a student's route or resource. And it's plural, and this is telling me I want to get all the students. And I do have to restart my server. And let's in fact just like add a message here. And we'll say like sending the client all the students, just so we can see our message show up. And I'm going to go ahead and run my Flask app. And now over here, instead of about, I can do API v1/students. And we see that we get all of that data back as JSON. And this is great. The browser is actually doing a little bit of work here for us. It's actually turning this list of dictionaries into text that's in the JSON format, but other clients might not do that as nicely as the browser does. So Flask actually has a library called JSONify, and we can use that to actually turn our list of dictionaries into students. So there's one extra step we have to do here to make this work. And to kind of demo the situation, let's see if this works with curl. So we actually get this back in JSON right now, which isn't bad. I'm actually a little impressed that curl was able to do this. But as we get deeper into this, we're going to want more control. Like I might not want to return the ID. That might be sensitive information. So I might want to write my own function that's going to do some of this work for me. So let's write, we call this a serializer when it turns something from one format into another. And it's going to take in one student. And let's have it return. Maybe we want the full name of the student. And actually we can probably use the bracket notation is probably a bit cleaner here. Apologies for jumping around here. Right, and as a friendly reminder, if I scroll up a bit, each student is a dictionary. We've got a first name, a last name. And so let's grab the first name, the last name, the age, and the grade. And we're not going to return the ID, and we're going to combine the first and last name into a full name. So we've got our full name, we've got age, and this one's much simpler. We can just do age, and we're going to do grade. And so this serializes or sort of transforms our student from one thing to another. We'll see this get more advanced in part 2 because we won't be dealing with dictionaries. We'll be dealing with instances of our student class, but we're not quite there yet. And now when I'm returning all my students, I can change my code a bit and use this serializer and do something like this. We'll call it serialized students. Actually, I'm going to get a little fancy here with a list comprehension. And we're going to do it like this. And so my list comprehension goes through each student in the list. It runs it through the serializer, and then we're using JSONify, which is a little overkill, but we'll want it later on. And fingers crossed, this still works. Let me restart my server. And I see that there's an error here. So let's see if I have a typo. I must have resolved my typo somewhere along the way. And if I refresh my page, we see now I just have age, full name, and grade. So just to recap, we're using this JSONify method that helps us turn dictionaries and other Python objects into JSON text. I wrote a serializer function that's sort of a helper function that takes our student information and reformats it and gives me only the parts that I care about. And then I'm using a list comprehension to go through all the students and transform them so that rather than seeing ID and first name and last name, I just see age, a full name, and a grade. So this lets me keep my student data like in this really nice fashion in my database, or in this case in my list. But then when I present it or send it back to the client, I can control how I do that. And so we've seen how to create a Flask server, how to run it, set some configuration settings, how to create different routes, which are just methods that we use this special decorator on. How when we create a route, we can tell it what path the route lives on, so that whether I'm using the browser or a command line program, for instance, maybe we have some JavaScript code like we do here that's going to grab our students. And so I've got my Flask server running in one shell session. And in another, let's run this JavaScript code that's actually going to talk to our Flask server. And it looks like I didn't save my file. Easy fix. We were still seeing the Pokemon data. And it looks like this is a good example of where the parsing and using JSONify is important. Though the browser and curl worked just fine with the ways we had formatted the data. There's a step I must have forgotten in the Flask code, which we can come back to later. But if we kind of, let me modify this code just a touch. And let's just see the HTTP response that our Flask server gives back. And I wonder if the issue here is the trailing slash at the end. This is a pretty common gotcha. Let's see if I add this here and I restart my Flask server and I run my JavaScript code again. So now we got data back Let's see if we can get the JSON or if we still are running into issues. And we can see that we got all this other sort of like metadata too about our response. And there we go. So the issue was, and this is always a bit of a gotcha. The browser doesn't care about the trailing slash. It handled it just fine. But the trailing slash does make a difference. So if I have it in the path here, I need to make sure it's also in my route, right? Or if I get rid of it here, I need to make sure that when I'm requesting that route, I have it the path correct. And we see we have our student information that we've gotten by having our JavaScript code make an HTTP request to our Flask API that's running on our computer on port 8000. So we've covered a lot of good ground. We've seen how to make a server. We've seen how to make a simple API server. And hopefully we're starting to have a good sense of what an API server is. And then we've seen how we can take our data that we know and love and we've been working with and return it to the user. And I see there's a couple questions. Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, I had the same issue with the with doing the first assessment. And I think it's a similar issue that's happening here. I noticed that what it's returning is out of order. I had that issue this weekend with a list, like it will send a list back out of order. Um, like age is not the first. Yeah, age is all the way back behind. Yeah. Is it because it's a list and well, it's not a dictionary, is it? Yeah, it's a list, not a dictionary. If you
turn
turn
students.
students into a dictionary, would it send it back in order?
Right, that's a good question. So with a list in Python, part of what a list does or a JavaScript array does is guarantee the order. When you turn a Python dictionary into a list, Python is not actually guaranteeing that order for you. It's usually consistent, but we really shouldn't rely on it. My guess is that's what you ran into. The rule of thumb is if we need to care about order, it needs to be a list. What other questions do folks have or what's on people's minds regarding what we've been covering with HTTP verbs and servers and APIs and Flask? All right, let's take a break. Perfect. I see we have a couple questions. Chris, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just curious. On your API.py file, I know you're doing HTML. I'm sure you can um instead of writing it there, you can import all that stuff, right?
Yeah,
Import all your HTML.
you could write an HTML file that we imported and returned here. Absolutely. Um, if we wanted to get fancier, we could also use a doc string, right? If we were doing something like this and about page, can you do an F string that's a doc string? What on a practical level, what ends up happening is what's called templating, where you usually don't have an HTML file, but it's maybe like Python or an HTML file that you can embed Python variables into. And I don't want to get too into that right now, but I think you can sort of see here how you can start to build this out. So yeah, you could return a file. You could also have like a template, like let's see here, Python Flask template. language. Jinja. Ah, yes, Jinja is a templating engine. And let's see if we have a good example. Now, we're not going to be doing this because we're going to be using React.js that runs in the browser that's actually going to generate our HTML. And so real Python usually has good stuff. And I just want to find a quick visual example of what a template looks like. Here we go. So this is a really simple example, but with a template engine like Jinja, you can write text, you can write HTML, and the same way we do with an F string, we can embed variables in it. And then our Python code would interpret it and feed in those variables. But again, we're not actually going to do this. This is sort of an older way of doing things. We're going to actually use React, which we'll get into later. But the server's job is going to be sending data like this to the browser. And then with React.js in the browser, we're actually going to take this and construct HTML. Alex, yes, sir.
So this client.js file, it's not part of your Flask server, correct? It's more of like a test suite.
Correct.
In a way.
Exactly. Exactly. And to go back to my much overused sort of system diagram here, in this scenario, this is client.js.
Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
great question.
And then
So-
on the right, with this Flask server that we've created, are we mimicking the cloud on our computer?
Great question. So short answer is yes, because our computer has its own network, right? The cloud is just a fancy name for a really big network spread over a bunch of data centers. It's a little bit out of scope right now. So the way to think about it is I have a network running on my own computer. And so I have Postgres running on a port. I have my Flask app running on a port. And so on my computer, I can run some code, like say client.js, and I can tell it to talk to a program on my own computer running on a port. And this is the little network running inside my computer. And then, like Rick was saying earlier, we can have multiple computers on a network. And I think the classic example of this is like maybe like a school network or a university network or businesses used to sort of have their own internal networks more. Now it gets a little more complicated with cloud-based stuff, but where you could have many different computers. Oh, excuse me. I was trying to, there we go. I could have a lot of different computers all running on the same network. And then when one computer wants to talk to another, it uses the IP address or the host name and the port. So if you and I had two computers on the same network and you wanted to talk to my Flask server, if you knew the port that my Flask program was running on, and I was allowing other computers to talk to that port, then client.js could send a request there, right? And instead of localhost 8000, it might be Adam's IP address, port 8000. Or, if my IP address was like 192.168, something like that. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't go too deep into networking in this course, but it's good to start getting used to this And again, the way to think about it is it's like an apartment building. And ports are like the different apartments in an apartment building. But you can have a whole bunch of different apartment buildings on the same block. I think, and that's not a bad metaphor, right? And so if I know the address of an apartment building and I know the apartment number, I can send someone there a message. Tom, yes, sir.
How would port forwarding affect our Flask server, if at all?
Let me tackle that one during the break. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about port forwarding, but that's a little out of scope right now. All right, let's take a break, folks. And when we come back, we are going to see, now that I have a Flask server, right? Instead of having to live here in a list, it's going into Postgres, and we're going to have Flask talk to Postgres, which is going to be awesome. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see you all shortly.